In 1968 and 1969, commercial pilots based in Miami, Florida, reported the discovery of mysterious stone formations under the shallow waters around the Bahama Islands. Oceanographers and divers investigating some of these locations quickly confirmed the presence of unusual structures, some of which appeared to be man-made. The most important discovery was made on the small island of Bimini, only 50 miles from Miami. A gigantic stone formation, looking like a collapsed wall or perhaps a road, was found in 14 feet of water just off the coast of Bimini. The Bimini Road, as it's now referred to, remains controversial to this day. Many people were convinced that the Bimini discoveries confirmed predictions made by the famous American psychic Edgar Cayce. In 1940, Cayce stated that a portion of the lost continent of Atlantis would be found there in 1968 or 1969. Nearly forgotten in the Bimini Road controversy were numerous reports about circular and rectangular stone structures located off the western coast of Andros Island. Andros is the largest of the Bahama Islands and lies about 100 miles to the southeast of Bimini. In 68 and 69, aerial photographs were taken of underwater formations in the shallow waters off Andros. But only one of the sites at Andros has ever been investigated firsthand. The underwater circles of Andros Island are perhaps more enigmatic and mysterious than the Bimini Road. No one has ever been able to visit these remote sites and discover what the formations are. But in 2003, my wife Laura and I decided to solve this 35-year-old mystery. Working with the official Edgar Cayce organization, we visited Andros and Bimini several times and undertook a difficult series of expeditions. What we found was surprising and led us to more mysteries. The discoveries made in the Bahamas began at Andros Island when pilots Trig Adams and Robert Brush spotted a rectangular underwater stone structure off North Andros. Dr. J. Manson Valentine and oceanographer Dmitry Rebekov visited the site almost immediately and declared it to be the ruins of a Mayan temple or perhaps even from the mythical continent of Atlantis. Only a few months later, Valentine discovered the Bimini Road and the search for Atlantis began in earnest at Bimini. While the focus of attention was turned to Bimini, perhaps the most intriguing find was made at Andros. In 1969, while flying over shallow water at extreme southern Andros, Adams and Brush saw what appeared to be a huge stone circle that seemed to be comprised of 2 or 3 concentric stone rings. Brush opened a window of the plane and took what is the only known photograph of the formation. It's been compared to standing stones in Great Britain and parts of Europe. Also in 1969, the French oceanographer Dmitry Rebekov saw an unusual underwater formation that looked like the cursive letter E while flying over western Andros. This strange formation has never been visited on water and is known as Rebekov's E. Finding and visiting both of these structures was one of our major goals. Our journey began by interviewing pilot Trig Adams at his home in Miami, Florida. Adams is still an active pilot, but Robert Brush died several years ago.
I'd helped Bob fly a plane load of live chickens down to San Juan, and this old Constellation had been stripped out. And after one takeoff and subsequent landing because of 2 engine problems, we took off, we got down there, unloaded the chickens. And I'd never flown a Connie before, so Bob said, "You fly it back." I was a little tired. I'd been up for about 30 hours, so I went back in the back to take a little snooze. I just couldn't stay awake any longer. And it seemed like just a few minutes later, the engineer came back and says, "Captain Brush wants to see you." So as I got back into the cockpit, I wasn't paying much attention. I was sitting down and strapping in. And Bob says, "Look to your right." Well, as I looked to my right, my window was open. We're cruising along at 500 feet above the western coast of Andros. and in a bank. He says, "You've got it." So I took the airplane. He says, "Look out there," and there's these two giant circles in shallow water just offshore. And I'm guessing that the larger circle was somewhere between 500 and 1,000 feet in diameter. The smaller circle was right around the 400 or 500 foot mark. I'm thinking that you'll probably find it down in here.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody ever asked you where it was?
People have been strangely uncurious about it.
We were completely surprised by Adam's statement that they actually saw two different circles at Andros. It was a clue we believed might be important when we looked for the circle of stone, and now we had the probable location of these mysterious formations. A few days later, we boarded our small charter plane and proceeded to survey the islands by air. From the air, Andros looks otherworldly. Massive tidal bays and ocean flows cut the island into thousands of smaller islands. Dense mangrove swamps, mud flats, pine forests, and jungle make Andros nearly impenetrable and unexplored. On the way to Andros and at several places on the western side of the island, in the water we saw what are called whitings. They form quickly and look like areas where milk has been poured into the seawater. Some writers have linked them to the Bermuda Triangle and claimed that they are radioactive, but they're probably formed by dying plankton releasing calcium. We found Ribicoff's E almost immediately and saw numerous rectangular structures in the water near it. This was near the area where the Andros Temple had been discovered in 1968. Blue holes, which are round openings on the surface containing fresh water, are located all over the island and in the shallow water around it. Occasionally, we'd see a plane which had crashed into the water, reminding us of the danger in the area. As we reached the middle of western Andros, dozens of circles could be seen on the shallow bottom, but as we went further south, the circles seemed to get larger. When we found the circle which seemed promising, we noted the location on a map and took GPS readings. When we reached extreme southwest Andros, we actually flew into Cuban airspace. It was an area where Trigg Adams had told us that few pilots venture. And right where Trigg thought the circles might be, we found a gigantic formation under shallow water. The circle looked vaguely similar to the brush photograph, but we knew we had to look at it firsthand. Still, as we viewed it from the air, we began to suspect that this could be the circle photographed by Brush back in 1969. Following Trigg Adams' clue about two circles seen in the same area, we flew further south looking for the second 1,000-foot circle he'd told us about. Only a few miles away, we found a gigantic white circle, which appeared to be at least 1,000 feet in diameter. It was an amazing sight. These were the most important formations we had to visit. After crisscrossing the area several times, we found that these were the only circles in the area where Trigg Adams had told us we should find them. but we'd have to visit the circles by boat to determine what they were. The Seascape Inn at Mangrove Key is a small but immaculately maintained resort situated right on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. No one we spoke to on Andros knew anything about the circles or Ribicoff's E, but everyone was intensely interested in what we were doing. The owners of the Seascape had arranged for a local sponge diver to take us to southwestern Andros, but it couldn't be done for another day. We hadn't expected a delay, so we had a full day to explore Mangrove Key. On a suggestion by the owners of the Seascape Inn, we visited the home of a 94-year-old Bahamian named Samuel Roll. It proved to be one of the most unusual experiences we had. Andros actually rests on a massive foundation of limestone, and running nearly the entire length of the island is a 100-foot-high limestone outcrop. Samuel Roll's home lies at the top of this outcrop, and he reportedly had the ruins of an ancient temple on his land, but it's never been examined by archaeologists. We followed a small path up the high hill to Samuel's home. The path cut through a dense jungle and was lined with flowers and fruit trees. When we reached a flat area, a small open house came into view. Immediately, an older man walked out with a wide smile and greeted us. We introduced ourselves, but he simply replied that it was good to see us again. Immediately, he told us to follow him, and he began peppering us with questions about our religion, our yard, and our pets. For the next hour, we followed this 94-year-old gentleman up a winding path through a tangled jungle filled with flowers, fruit trees, and ornamentals. Occasionally, Samuel sat down on a pile of limestone blocks and quoted from the Bible. He spoke about right and wrong and said that all people of all races were from the same source. Then he'd look into our eyes and ask what we thought. As we neared the top of the limestone hill, stone blocks were lying in piles nearly everywhere. Samuel said that his only regret in life was selling truckloads of blocks from the site back in the 1930s. The blocks were used in construction projects at Mangrove Key, and other residents verified this fact to us. As we reached his temple site, the view of the surrounding area was spectacular. We found what seemed to be the remains of a rectangular formation which appeared to have once been 3 tiers high. Samuel told us that this was the area where the building blocks had been taken from. He then sat down and told us several incredible stories. According to Samuel, in truly ancient times, several meetings of the world's leaders were held at the temple site. He was here, he told us, in a past life. He didn't know what the meetings were about, but he looked at us and said, "You were here too. That's why you came back." According to Samuel, these meetings were held at a time before Indians had entered the continent and at a time when Andros was much larger. He couldn't say when it was, only that it was long, long ago. It was easy to visualize a small temple structure at the site, and the structure would have had a commanding view of the ocean and area to the west. Samuel also related that in ancient times, when Andros was an important civilization, Jesus was there. He wasn't the biblical Jesus, but was an earlier individual with the same soul. According to Samuel, the area was the site of an ongoing moral struggle between two groups. We were intrigued because what Samuel told us is echoed in Edgar Cayce's story of Atlantis. He ended by telling us that his purpose was to have the site recognized for what it was and to leave it as a place where people could simply come and visit. His time was running out, but it didn't make him sad.
My grandfather, my daddy, my uncle, them all done gone. Only me now.
When we returned to the seascape, we were amazed by the unexpected encounter with Mr. Roll. His stories matched a lot of what Edgar Cayce said about ancient Atlantis, and meeting him before we began our expeditions was an interesting coincidence. Our expedition to the first circles at southwestern Andros was scheduled for the next day, and now we were even more excited about it. And at 7:30 the next morning, we were off. We left the seascape on a 12-foot boat designed for sponge collecting. Kevin Green, a 16-year veteran of sponge diving, was our guide. While our GPS showed that the first circle we wanted to visit was only 26 miles away, we had to maneuver through the complex South Bight, which cuts all the way through the island. It was about 40 miles on water and took 3 hours to get to the other side of Andros. Because we had to carry nearly 40 gallons of gas, we planned on only going to the first 2 circles on the first day. The visit to the circles we thought could be the ones seen by Brush and Adams would be completed the next day. It was an incredible trip. When we reached the GPS coordinates of the first circle, we found the shallow bottom was covered with confusing patterns of turtle grass. It was impossible to discern the formation. We soon moved north to the second site and landed right on top of it. On water, it looked exactly like it did from the air. The bottom was a soft white mud, and the circle was formed by turtle grass. We asked Kevin if he thought that a circle of stones might be under the surface. He replied that he doubted it, but we pushed a long pull into the turtle grass forming the outer ring. The mud was deep, and we never touched anything solid. Moving further north, we found several other smaller circles we had also seen from the air. They were all formed by turtle grass and were embedded in a deep mud. Kevin decided to pull into the shore, but because the water was only a foot deep, we had to get out and push the boat. On the way in, we stopped for a few moments. Well, the west side of Andros, Mangrove Key, and this, if it's not the muck of the ages or the slime of the ages, I don't know what is. Actually, the water here is maybe a foot deep, and I'm sunk down now about
2.5 feet or so into it. The stuff's like paste, but it's mud. It is a pure white mud. And we have taken our boat in as far as we can go because we're dragging bottom. And I'm just sinking.
The reason why these places look like this is because of the hurricane we had in Michelle.
So the mangroves actually were right on the water at one
Yes.
time, weren't they?
Right.
On our excursions to western Andros, we never saw another boat, person, or plane. Western Andros is completely uninhabited and isolated. As we looked at the barren landscape, we understood why no one else had tried to solve these mysteries. And then, unexpectedly and spontaneously, Kevin explained the mysterious circles of Andros to us.
This here, this is the grass, right?
Yeah.
This is the grass, just about maybe 10 miles, 15 miles out. And it's a head, different little reefs, coral reef right here in the middle of the grass. We have about maybe 200-300 or more different type of fish right around this head. And time after time they swim in and out under this head. The mud just keep on kicking out and just whiten this area. And on the outside of here remains the grass, round and round, which make it perfectly form in a circle. It just form a white cycle within the grass, you know. The black grass is right on the outside here, and it's just shaved like this. It's just shaved just like that, and they'll never touch this area here. They only clean their house around. This is their house. Their head is their house, and they clean their yard out. You know?
How many of those are there?
Out here,
Yeah.
you have hundreds,
Hundreds
maybe
of them.
thousands out there.
We were stunned by Kevin's explanation, but we had to return to Mangrove Key before sunset. We went north through Middlebite to return to the eastern side of Andros. Just before we reached the Atlantic Ocean side, we encountered a few sponge divers. Their lines of collected sponges floating on the surface looked a lot like piled stones. This later proved to be an important observation. When we returned to the seascape, we ate and borrowed a book on Bahamian marine biology from the inn's bookshelf. Before we went to sleep that night, we were surprised to find Kevin's explanation of the circles in the book. According to the text, there are hundreds of these circles in the Bahamas, and they are all natural. The explanation was wonderful because perhaps this 35-year-old mystery had been solved, but it was also irritating and perplexing. We wondered why so many writers and scientific investigators had never asked locals about the circles or even checked what marine biology textbooks had to say about it. We left early the next morning for the much longer trip to the two circles at extreme southwest Andros. This time we carried over 70 gallons of gas. We fully expected to find that the circles were made from turtle grass, but we were wrong. When we left the seascape, the sky looked ominous, but the air was strangely calm. The water became as smooth as glass, reflecting the sky. Kevin told us that the smooth water was very unusual. When we reached the GPS coordinates, Kevin saw the first circle immediately, but it was so large we had trouble seeing it from the boat. After maneuvering around it slowly, we began to perceive its shape. As we went around the main ring of the circle, from the boat, it appeared to be formed from large stones stuck into the bottom. In several places, 3 rings of these stones were visible. On the outside of the large circle was what appeared to be an expansive area strewn with large stones.
That's it out there?
Yeah, that's
okay. I
that's
see.
it also.
Now, are these all stones?
No, sir, not all stone.
While Kevin was being diplomatic and kind in response to my question, at the same time he was also excited at what he was seeing. I got out of the boat and found the water only 1 to 3 feet deep. The bottom had little or no sand on it, and the solid limestone foundation of the island was clearly visible.
There's a complete white cycle around this dark area.
Okay, that's what we saw from here, the white circle.
The only way for us to really see what the strange forms in the water actually were was to look at them underwater. As Kevin had explained, the main ring forming the huge circle was made from giant sponges, some of which were as big as barrels. In many places, what looked like 3 rings of sponge were seen. They were attached to exposed areas of the flat bottom, and a small layer of sand, no more than a 1/4 inch deep, was between the rings of sponge. The thin layer of sand kept the sponge from attaching to the bottom.
That's a sponge?
That is a type of sponge, yes.
We were all now convinced that this was the circle spotted by Brush and Adams in 1969. As small waves passed over the formation, tops of a few large sponges would occasionally be exposed, looking exactly like standing stones. They looked like the sponges we'd seen floating in the water on the prior day. We measured the circle with the GPS and found it to be 336 feet in diameter. This was in line with what Trig Adams had told us. All that was left now was to take a look at the bigger circle a few miles further south. We found it immediately.
This is the key right here, right on the map, what you mark.
Yeah, this is it. This is it.
The gigantic white circle was formed by a forest of sponges encircling a huge sandy area created by a small coral head in the center. It was at least 1,000 feet in diameter. Kevin's amazement at the sponges in this area was driven by a commercial interest. These were the highest grade of sponge found in the Bahamas, and he told us that he'd eventually make a trip here to collect them. He'd have to remain here for a couple of weeks to get them, but it would be worth it. Both of these circles were located right where Trig Adams told us they'd probably be, and both were about the same size Trig estimated. When we compared the original brush photo to our aerial video of the smaller circle, we became certain that they were the same. In the brush photo, part of the formation was obscured by shadows, and the angle of the photo was different from ours. When we rotated the brush photo to correspond with the orientation of our shots, major portions of the formations perfectly matched. Amazingly, after 35 years, the circular formation is still there and in the same basic shape. Back in 1969, there were probably fewer sponges there, and the water may have been at low tide when they took the photograph. The lower water would have exposed the tops of some of the taller sponges. While we planned to visit Ribicoff's E on this trip, several unexpected airplane problems prohibited it. This meant we'd have to return to Andros soon, but we had to get back to the States first. Before we left, we were led to a large cave complex in Mangrove Key by a local resident, Cleome Farrington. Over 20 years ago, at least one rock carving called a petroglyph was found in an underwater cave at Andros. We didn't find any petroglyphs in the cave we visited, but the presence of the underwater carving meant that someone had lived in Andros when the sea levels were lower, at least 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, and Samuel Roll's flattened temple site suggested that perhaps these people left after a major disaster occurred. Just over a month later, we returned to Andros with one main objective. We intended to find Ribicoff's E on water and determine what it was. We took another set of GPS coordinates on the formation from the air and also noted the numerous rectangular sponge pens in the water near it. The structures are off the tiny town of Red Bay, the only real settlement on the western coast of Andros. We had to stay in Nicholstown on northeastern Andros and planned on finding a guide to take us to Red Bay. We were lucky to connect with a former Bahamian professional basketball player named Prince Maya, who drove us to Red Bay, taking along one of his powerful jet boats. Because the water was choppy, spotting forms under the surface was difficult. The water was 15 to 20 feet deep, and we actually had several sets of GPS coordinates on Ribicoff's E. The coordinates were close to each other, but not identical. When we reached one of the GPS coordinates, we stopped over a dark formation looming on the bottom. I got out of the boat and snorkeled around the area, but it was only a small circle of turtle grass, which we'd actually seen from the air the prior day. We immediately started for the next set of GPS coordinates and decided to search the area between them. After making the systematic search, we found the E-shaped formation.
I'd say we solved the mystery of Ribicoff's E.
Off of Red Bay.
It's an interesting formation of seaweed and sponge, but mainly seaweed.
The formation centered on a small, odd-shaped coral head, and it was basically a partial circle of turtle grass and sponge. There was about an inch of sand on the bottom, but under the sand was the solid limestone foundation of the island. Ribicoff's E was natural, just like the circles at southwestern Andros. Since we found Ribicoff's E so quickly, we looked at several of the rectangular and circular sponge pens in the area. There were so many rectangular pens there that figuring out which one was the original Andros temple discovered back in 1968 was impossible. Kevin Green had told us that his family built rectangular pens back in the 1920s and 30s before the business collapsed because of a virus that killed all the sponge. Valentine wrote that the Andros sponge collectors never built rectangular pens and never used stone in their construction. Valentine apparently didn't speak to any locals at all or even check on written sources explaining the sponge business. Today's sponge pens are constructed in the same manner they've always been. Long sticks or poles are pushed into the mud bottom and lashed together. Then, boatloads of stones are often piled up along the bottom of the poles to provide support against the constant waves. The process of sponge cleaning involves several stages, and smaller circular pens are usually built next to the larger rectangular ones. The rectangular pens are subdivided into different sections to hold different types of sponge at various stages of the cleaning process. Valentine's original photo of the Andros Temple provides a major clue to the purpose of the rectangular pile of stones he investigated. In the upper left-hand side of the photo, a small circular sponge pen is visible. There is no doubt whatsoever that the Andros Temple was actually a sponge pen. We returned to Nicholstown and visited a famous blue hole. Then we went to the cave used by pirate Henry Morgan. A torrential thunder shower suddenly hit Andros, and we returned to our motel to rest before we flew back home the next day. The thunderstorm stopped at 8 p.m., and we heard a light knock at our door. It was 61-year-old Dino Keller, a former dive operator at Andros. After speaking to him for nearly 2 hours about our project, he told us something we found unbelievable.
I think it was in 1992. I had some divers on the boat, and we were coming back from a dive, and instead of going on the outside of the reef, I decided to go on the inside of the reef. I was on the fly bridge, and I happened to see these massive stones on the bottom. So I stopped the boat and looked at them and kept going, and then I got thinking, geez, this is another Bimini Road. It was pretty interesting what I saw because it was out of the norm. And I've been on the Bimini Road, and it looked like the Bimini Road, but it looked bigger.
Dino told us that the formation was in Nicholstown Bay and was probably uncovered by Hurricane Andrew. As best as he remembered, he thought it was about 100 yards off the shore. We were flying out the next day at 1 o'clock, and Dino couldn't take us to the bay in the morning, but we decided that if the formation was actually there, we'd find it before we left. Early the next morning, we walked to the bay carrying our gear. I began by snorkeling out about 500 yards into the ocean, but didn't see anything of interest on the bottom of the 25-foot deep water. I then moved to a different area and snorkeled straight out into the ocean. The bottom moved up quickly as I got about 600 yards into the ocean, and then, suddenly, there it was.
It was a lot bigger than the Bimini Road. It's got some coral on it, but it's a lot bigger. It's got cyclopean stones, and I'm not sure what they are. I can't tell. I broke my knife off, and I'm trying to break a piece off, a stainless steel diving knife, but I'm not sure. It's much, much larger. It's probably about 100, 150 feet wide. I have no idea how long it is. I couldn't get to the end.
I took an underwater camera with me with 15 photos remaining on the roll of film. I took all the shots before I reached the best areas of the structure. The photos were interesting but not impressive, and they didn't show what I'd actually seen. There were numerous square and rectangular stone blocks in the area, and they looked like they were in a pattern, but it was time to leave. As we spoke about the discovery, we knew we'd have to return to scuba dive the site and videotape it. In 2001 and 2002, the ARE sponsored a satellite imaging project of 630 square kilometers around the small island of Bimini. The project was designed to give precise GPS coordinates of everything around Bimini and perhaps reveal previously undiscovered underwater formations. But only 2 types of seemingly anomalous formations were found. No one had examined these formations, so we decided to investigate them during the Andros expeditions. At northeast Bimini, just off the coast, several dark lines that were supposedly straight were photographed by the satellite. The report to the ARE indicated that these might be high walls where sand had duned against the sides. The lines in the satellite image didn't really look linear, and we suspected that they were natural. We had seen the area in a flyover of Bimini and spoken to locals about the forms. Locals said they were sand channels and seaweed, but we still had to investigate them. We chartered a boat with K&B Easy Dive from South Bimini and went to the location of the lines. Just like Esley and Krista Brown had told us, they were simply sand channels. Seaweed had rooted on the tops of the long sand channels because there's less water movement there. The seaweed had formed the dark lines on the satellite images. Over the years, people have looked all over Bimini for possible evidence of Atlantis. Several effigy mounds have been discovered on Bimini by ARE researchers, but the effigy mound culture of America is only 3,000 to 4,000 years old. These are certainly interesting formations and are probably man-made, but they can't date to the Ice Age or the time of Atlantis. The second seemingly anomalous formation found in the ARE satellite project was a series of circles off the coast of South Bimini. There were about a dozen of them found, but we'd become especially intrigued by one of them. It was 200 feet in diameter and had curious shapes within it. Before we visited the large circle, we went to several of the smaller ones. They were depressions in the sandy bottom and looked like someone had taken a cookie cutter and cored them out. We found out that construction projects on South Bimini dragged barges through the area, and that sand and stone was often dredged from the bottom. Nevertheless, we aren't sure what these smaller circles really are. Many of the other smaller circles are probably similar to the circles off Andros, and we believe that they're probably not important in the search for Atlantis. On several flyovers of the large 200-foot circle, we saw breakers moving over it. This meant that it had to be elevated off the bottom. The more we looked at it, the more intrigued we became. We found the large circle with Esley and Krista Brown of K&B Easy Dive. The area of the formation is so shallow that it's not a place where many boats go, so the Browns had no idea what it was. We had initially thought that a crashed plane might have created the formation. The shallow water in this area is not far from the Bimini runway, and a lot of planes were lying on the bottom here. Under the water, the formation looked like a small conical burial mound. It gradually moved upward to a height of 5 or 6 feet from the bottom, but on the top of the mound, in several places, the sand was gouged out, creating deep depressions. There were vertical walls of sand in these depressions. As I moved to one of the walls of an inner depression in the mound, I pushed an arm into the sand. About a foot inside the wall, I found a white stone. It was subsequently sent off for chemical and X-ray testing when we returned to the States. The chemical analysis revealed that it was a clump of calcium formed by natural sea processes. It wasn't of help in determining the origin of this mound. Inside another depression of the mound, I pushed my arm about 1.5 feet into the sandy wall. I pulled out a rectangular stone which looked exactly like a broken brick. When the chemical analysis on the brick came back, the results were conclusive. The mound was probably man-made. The brick turned out to be a brick, which had been made sometime in the middle 1900s. Our conclusion was simple and disappointing. Someone probably dumped a load of modern building materials there, causing the mound to form. At Bimini, we also looked at numerous natural beach rock formations to compare to the Andros structure and the Bimini Road. Beach rock lines the beach at Bimini and under the shallow waters of the shoreline. The major controversy about the Bimini Road revolves around whether or not it was formed from a single gigantic piece of beach rock which fractured in place. Despite what a few skeptics have claimed, no one has ever tested enough of the Bimini Road stones to prove that they were all once part of the same block. We did find a few pieces of square and rectangular beach rock on the shore, but not as many of these as skeptics have led us to believe were there. Skeptics have long claimed that there are long lines of rectangular and square beach rock on Bimini, but we never saw anything like that. Nevertheless, some of the beach rock at Bimini does bear a slight resemblance to the Bimini Road. Some of the Bimini Road is, no doubt, formed from beach rock, but as our final investigations at Andros showed, beach rock, which is usually limestone in the Bahamas, was a common construction stone in the ancient world. In fact, most of the Great Pyramid's 1 million stones were cut from limestone. We flew between Bimini and Andros Islands 8 different times. On the seabed, we saw pentagon-shaped formations, numerous circular formations, nearly every letter of the alphabet, and hundreds of what look like white dots. It's likely that most of these, if not all of them, are natural. Yet, it seemed to us that there was something important missing in the history of the region. Archaeologists tell us that no one lived in the Bahamas until only about 1,000 years ago, but the petroglyphs at Andros seem to say otherwise. As we returned to Andros to look closely at the underwater stone formation, we hoped that it might reveal the answer to what we were seeking, and perhaps we hoped the underwater Andros structure could also explain the Bimini Road. In April and June, we returned to Andros to document the underwater stone formation we initially found there in March of 2003. Prince Maya again assisted us, and we planned on videotaping, photographing, and measuring the structure. The structure was so large that initially its layout was difficult to understand. The water at Andros is sometimes murky and moves quickly, and this often impeded our work. The tidal flows at Nicholstown can be brutal and can quickly push both snorkelers and scuba divers from one area to another. Laura snorkeled on the surface and photographed or videotaped as I measured and took a close look at the formation while scuba diving. Initially, Dino Keller had told us that from the surface he saw 3 long rows of large stones. In between each row of stones was a long row of sand, but as we soon discovered, the formation was far more complex than that. The 3 long rows of stones Dino described were the easiest to see. These rows were actually the leading edge of 3 flat tiers. The formation increased in height as we followed it further into the ocean. This is something natural beach rock doesn't do. The tiers were situated on top of each other, looking somewhat like a huge, multi-tiered temple foundation. After we measured the structure and made drawings of it while underwater, it became apparent that it was a gigantic stone platform, 150 feet wide and about 450 yards long. The bottom tier seemed to be in 15 feet of water. The water over the top tier was about 10 feet deep. Each of the 3 tiers was about 50 feet wide. On the inside of the platform, toward the beach, rectangular stone blocks situated in a long row formed the front part of each tier. These blocks were mostly 25 by 30 feet and 2 feet thick. They were so big that the wide-angle lenses to our video and still cameras were usually unable to get a complete stone in a single frame. The front edges on some of these showed a pillowing effect, much like the stones of the Bimini Road. This is probably due to erosion. There were thin seams between the stone blocks, and seaweed was growing in them. Behind the leading edge of the huge stone blocks on each of the 3 tiers was a flat, mostly sandy area about 20 feet wide. In places where there wasn't any sand present, a flat mosaic of smaller square and rectangular stones was found. We brushed away sand in several areas and found the mosaic of smaller stones always present under the sand. These smaller stones were directly adjacent to the back edges of the large blocks on the front of the tier. The front side of many of the large blocks on the second tier showed no erosion, and their facings were nearly vertical and straight-edged. The third or highest tier was partly covered by sand, but a row of large stone blocks was on its leading edge. Immediately behind the third tier, we found some smaller stone blocks, but sand had almost completely covered everything. The famous coral reef of Andros, running nearly 140 miles long, was found about 50 yards further out. Immediately on the other side of this reef is the tongue of the ocean. The tongue of the ocean is a 2-mile deep trench that's about 140 miles long and 40 miles wide. The platform encloses a major portion of Nicholstown Bay. The northernmost portion of the platform was covered with a large mound of sand, and immediately on the other side of the mound, a deep channel led into Nicholstown Bay. We saw evidence of fracturing on many of the blocks, and coral was beginning to form on parts of the structure. Whatever the formation was, it's gradually becoming a coral reef now. On one of our trips to Andros, we planned on brushing away a large area of the platform which was covered with sand, to expose some of the seams. We had noted that not all of the seams looked straight and wondered exactly what the sand-covered seams looked like. On the day we performed this task, a brutal tidal flow was present, making the work difficult. We chose a small area where a large rectangular block on the front row of the second tier joined to several smaller stones behind it. The seams were just under an inch thick and were filled with pebbles and sand which had tightly wedged into them. A dive knife had to be used to pry out some of the small stones that had fallen into the seams. When we began, the seams in this area looked crooked. However, it quickly became apparent that small pebbles and debris protruded from the seams, causing an irregular buildup of sand on the surface. This gave some of them a crooked appearance. After removing the sand and debris down 5 inches into the seams, the stones looked like they'd been cut and placed there. One of the criticisms of the Bimini Road stones is that no ancient tool marks have been found there. But at Andros, we believe we may have found a ramp leading from the harbor lagoon up to the top of the platform. But even more importantly, although we were not looking for tool marks at Andros, our video turned up something rather curious. While I was changing scuba tanks, Laura videotaped several areas of the platform from the surface. When we later reviewed the videotape, we discovered what seems to be a square indentation about 5 inches across and at least 5 inches deep. It appears to have been cut into the stone and looks about the size of a post hole. We also saw other indentations which appeared to have been cut into the stone. On our last visit to Andros, we were led to an area about a half-mile north of the platform by Dino Keller. He had seen some smaller stones in that area and believed that they might be another part of the structure. Laura and I snorkeled the location for nearly 2 hours, taking only an underwater camera. We found a massive, perfectly flat area situated just in front of the reef. Most of the bottom was covered by sand, but in several places we saw what looked like paving stones carefully joined together. It was an incredible find, and one that helped lead to a tentative hypothesis about the Andros platform and the Bimini Road. In June of 2004, we returned to Andros with a production team from the National Geographic. One of the most intriguing things we did was revisit Samuel Roll's temple site at Mangrove Key. Samuel is now 96 years old and in failing health, but he was extremely happy to see us and wanted to tell his story. But rather than discuss the temple, Samuel focused on the idea that powerful spiritual forces were on the earth. He wasn't able to gather his thoughts, so one of his grandsons who knew about the site was interviewed. Less than 2 weeks before we arrived, Samuel made his grandson Floyd keeper of the temple. At the site where the temple once stood, Floyd related that he and a friend had begun clearing some of the undergrowth from the area about a week before we arrived. What emerged were definite lines where some sort of buildings had once stood. But even more interestingly, Floyd found a small pile of rocks in the temple area that was about 3 feet in diameter. As he and his friend began clearing away the rocks, they found that the pile of stones concealed a hole into the limestone hill. They cleared the round hole to a depth of over 10 feet and then removed a wall of stones at the bottom. Behind the wall of stones was a tunnel-like cave running 40 feet under the hill. In the tunnel, they found several artifacts, including old conch shells with holes drilled into the ends. On camera, Floyd demonstrated how the shells could be used like a loud horn by blowing into the hole. We now have no doubt that Mr. Roll's temple site did have some sort of structures on it. It would have made an ideal outlook over the wide, deep-water channel running by Andros. Returning to the underwater Andros platform at Nicholstown proved to be both frustrating and intriguing. We had planned on investigating the apparent tool mark we found there in 2003, and also at the area where paving stones seemed to lie on the flat bottom. But during the past year, many violent storms went through the area, shifting the sand. Large portions of the platform were now under sand, and dense areas of turtle grass were growing. In addition, we saw an astonishing new growth of coral on many of the exposed areas of the platform. The area that had the paving stones was covered in a dense sand that formed a massive white cloud when we tried to brush it away. Our efforts to view the paving stones and the tool mark were frustrated by the dense, sticky sand. On the plus side, the water we experienced at Andros was the clearest we'd ever seen, and with a full moon and low tide, the water was several feet shallower and quite still. While many areas of the platform that had been exposed in 2003 were now covered, we were pleasantly surprised to find that other areas had been uncovered by the same storms. We were able to see several new areas of the platform. Some of the most interesting parts of the structure seemed to have what may have once been wide steps up the platform. We also saw new areas comprised of huge rectangular blocks of stone. Most of these were situated in layers forming tiers. Just as we found in 2003, the tiers of the formation increased in height as we went further into the ocean. The platform may be comprised of beach rock, but the fact that the stones are in multiple layers and that they get higher as you move away from the beach argue against the formation being natural. Snorkeling with us, one of the members of the National Geographic team said that she was very impressed with what she saw. It was more impressive than the underwater Mediterranean sites she had visited just before coming to Andros. After we arrived back in the States, I became aware of an analysis of the Andros platform and the Bimini Road that had been done by a computer specialist who works at the University of Leiden's Department of Physics. Dr. Rudolf Zuestra had carefully examined our video frame showing the tool mark on the Andros platform. I was astonished to find that Dr. Zuestra had found another tool mark in her video frame that had escaped our attention. Even more astonishing was the fact that he had found at least 7 identical tool marks at ancient Peruvian sites. Dr. Zuestra believes that the weight of evidence is on the side of both the Andros platform and the Bimini Road being man-made. One of the most interesting facts that's been ignored in the debate over the Bimini Road relates to the first person who declared that the road stones were actually beach rock. That person was Dr. J. Manson Valentine, the original discoverer of the road site. Valentine believed that the stones comprising the road were primarily beach rock, which had been removed from the shoreline and carefully placed in their present location. Dr. Valentine's cohort, Dmitry Rebekov, agreed that the stones were beach rock and theorized that the road site could actually have been an ancient breakwater which enclosed a harbor. Skeptics have argued that the road site has only one tier of stones, but they always ignore a well-known fact. In 1926, numerous barges were filled with stones that were dredged up from the road site. The barges were taken to Miami, where the stones were used to repair breakwaters. No one knows what the road site actually looked like before that time. Since 1968, dozens of ancient harbors enclosed by breakwaters have been discovered in the Mediterranean. A few of these harbors date to about 8,000 years ago. Just like Dmitry Rebekov asserted over 35 years ago, nearby sources of beach rock were used in their construction. Square and rectangular blocks of beach rock were cut and then placed directly on the bottom. Several tiers of the blocks were piled on top of each other and formed into long breakwaters. The dimensions of both the Bimini Road and the Andros platform are in line with many of these ancient harbors. The oldest Mediterranean harbors were constructed of large blocks of beach rock piled into multiple layers. Either on the top tier or at an adjacent site, a quay was built. A quay is a paved staging area where cargo is moved. At Andros, The seemingly paved area to the north of the platform has the characteristics of a key. We theorize that the Bimini Road and the Andros platform could have served as breakwaters and closing harbors as long ago as perhaps 9,000 years. The sea levels at that time were somewhat lower due to the still ending ice age, but even prior to that time, when the sea levels were much more than 100 feet lower, both formations would have had commanding views of the deep water passages that flow by them. Both Bimini and Andros would have been perfect way stations for ships at that time. The search for Plato and Edgar Cayce's Atlantis is actually a search for a mysterious Ice Age maritime culture. In 10,000 BC, the ocean levels were several hundred feet lower than today, and islands in the Atlantic and Bahamas were much larger. In fact, Bimini and Andros were both part of the same large island at that time. In 11,000 BC, Atlantis may well have been an island empire extending from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean. The main islands of the empire may have included a small island just outside the Straits of Gibraltar called Spartel. The Canary and Mid-Atlantic Ridge Islands were also a portion of Atlantis, but the most important islands may well have been the Bahamas and Cuba. According to researchers such as Andrew Collins, the Atlantis Empire was destroyed by a fragmenting comet which hit the eastern United States and the Atlantic Ocean in about 10,000 BC. The Carolina Bays, over 500,000 impact craters found in eastern America, are a visible reminder of this catastrophe. Collins believes that Cuba may hold the key to the discovery of Atlantis, and our study of satellite images of Cuba does show a promising site for the center city of Atlantis. It's in the Zapata Peninsula. At Zapata, an underwater island about 7 miles in diameter appears to fit all of Plato's descriptions of the city. The site has ancient man-made canals leading to the north, springs on the underwater island, and a ring of mountains to the north. While the ARE's search for Atlantis will continue in the Bahamas, Cuba will also become an increasingly important focal point. If any remains of Atlantis still exist, they eventually will be found. Until then, evidence of an ancient maritime culture traveling the world's oceans during the last ice age will be found from time to time, and claims that Atlantis has been found nearly everywhere in the world will continue to be made, perhaps because the ancient Atlanteans exerted their influence nearly everywhere.
He's hiding.
Up there, I see. You can't hide from it.
Move it.